The biggest myth in business right now is that adopting Copilot Coworker leads to immediate productivity gains. But in reality, the teams using AI the most are often the least productive. They aren't scaling value, they're just amplifying broken processes at superhuman speed. To win, you have to stop being a supervisor of people and start becoming an architect of collaborative systems. The digital intern mental model is the single biggest thing sabotaging your ROI. If you treat AI like a junior assistant, you've already lost the transition. Let's talk about why. The event. Why the coworker transition is stalling. The launch of Copilot Coworker changed the game, but most leadership teams missed the memo. This isn't just another chatbot. We've moved past the era of simple Q&A. This is an agentic system. It doesn't just talk, it plans, it reasons, and it executes across your entire Microsoft 365 ecosystem. The system is built on a plan and execute architecture that coordinates tasks between your calendar, your inbox, and your documents simultaneously. Yet despite this massive leap in capability, the transition in most organizations is stalling. It's hitting a wall. The reason is what I call the prompt then fix trap. Managers are currently caught in a loop where they spend 10 minutes crafting a prompt and then 20 minutes fixing the inconsistent, hallucinated, or poorly formatted output. They're trying to manage the AI the same way they'd manage a human intern. They give a vague instruction, wait for a draft, and then manually correct the errors. But here's the problem. That manual integration burden negates every second of time the AI saved. If the manager has to touch the file to make it client-ready, the system is broken. You haven't gained efficiency. You've just added a noisy middleman to your morning. The data confirms this struggle. Current research shows that roughly 80% of AI pilots fail to reach full production. That is a staggering number. These organizations aren't failing because the technology is buggy. They're failing because they treated a license purchase as a proxy for organizational maturity. They handed out the keys without redesigning the car. They assumed that if they gave 300 people a Copilot license, productivity would just happen. Instead, what they got was shadow automation sprawl. Employees are using AI in silos. One person uses it to summarize meetings they didn't attend, while another uses it to draft emails that sound nothing like the company brand. There is no standard. There is no version control for logic. Because there's no structural redesign of the workflow, the outputs are inconsistent. One day, the AI produces a brilliant report, and the next day, it misses 3 key data points because the grounding data in SharePoint was messy. When you treat AI as an intern, you expect it to learn through osmosis. But AI doesn't have intuition. It only has the environment you built for it. When that environment is chaotic, the AI scales that chaos. It creates a massive volume of almost good work that clogs up your review cycles and creates new risks. You end up with a library of unmanaged apps, duplicate logic, and a workforce that is busier than ever but producing less meaningful impact. Most managers see this and blame the tool. They say the AI isn't ready or it isn't smart enough yet. They wait for the next model update to solve their problems. But the model isn't the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the assumption that AI can be supervised like a person. You cannot hold an agentic loop accountable for a hallucination. You cannot have a one-on-one with a system to discuss its performance. The failure we are seeing across the M365 landscape isn't a technology shift, it's a management failure. We are trying to run a 2026 agentic system using a 1990s supervision model. To fix the stall, we have to look one level deeper. We have to change the fundamental relationship between the manager, the data, and the machine. We have to move from the person-to-person model to something entirely different. We have to stop managing and start building. That is where the architect move begins. The reasoning, from supervision to system architecture. We have to acknowledge a hard truth about leadership in this new era, and that truth is that the traditional model of supervision is officially dead. For decades, a manager's job was relatively simple because you just hired the right people, assigned them the right tasks, and watched them work. You supervised the individual. You checked their progress, gave them feedback, and held them accountable for the final deliverable. That model assumes the human is the engine. But when you introduce an agentic system like Copilot Coworker, the human is no longer the engine. The system is. If you try to supervise an AI the same way you supervise a person, you're trying to manage a ghost. You can't look an algorithm in the eye and ask for more effort, and you certainly can't inspire a large language model to care more about the client. This is where the shift happens. You have to move from supervising the person to engineering the collaborative friction. This is the architect move. It's the realization that your job isn't to manage the output. It's to design the environment that makes the output inevitable. Think about how a traditional supervisor handles a messy report. They sit down with the employee and explain what's wrong, and they hope the employee learns for next time. But an architect looks at that same messy report and asks a different question. Where did the data flow break? They don't blame the person, they diagnose the system. They realize that if the AI produced a hallucination, it's because the grounding data was unstructured or the intent was vague. AI doesn't just make mistakes, it scales existing flaws at superhuman speed. If your internal SharePoint is a digital graveyard of outdated PDFs, Copilot will find them. It will treat a 2018 policy like a 2026 mandate because you haven't architected the boundaries. This creates a massive shift in accountability. In the old world, if a project failed, you looked for the person responsible. In the new world, you can't hold an agent responsible because it has no skin in the game. Therefore, the manager must own the system design itself. You are no longer responsible for the task. You are responsible for the logic that governs the task. This means moving your focus from who owns this to how does the data flow as intent. Intent is the fuel of the coworker era. When a manager gives a vague instruction to a human, the human uses intuition to fill the gaps. They know the context. They know the unwritten rules. AI has no intuition. It only has the context you provide through work IQ and your prompt libraries. If your intent is fuzzy, the system's execution will be chaotic. The architect's job is to harden that intent. You have to build the guardrails that prevent the AI from drifting, and you have to decide, with clinical precision, where the machine stops and where the human takes over. And this is what I call engineering the friction. Most leaders think friction is bad. They want seamless automation. But in a world of agentic AI, seamlessness is dangerous. It leads to unreviewed errors and silent failures. An architect strategically places friction back into the workflow. They design check and approve gates. They build mandatory verification loops for high-stakes decisions. They treat the workflow like a blueprint, not a to-do list. The move from supervisor to architect is the difference between watching the race and building the track. If the track is broken, it doesn't matter how fast the car is. Most managers are still trying to coach the driver. The architect is out there fixing the asphalt. They are cleaning the data, versioning the prompts, and mapping the capability gaps. They understand that autonomy only scales when the boundaries are clear. Without architecture, you just have a very expensive, very fast way to make mistakes. Now let's see how this actually looks when it fails in the real world. Caselet 1, the pilot that scaled nothing. Let's look at how this failure manifests in a real-world enterprise environment. Consider a mid-sized financial services firm that recently launched a pilot program for 300 employees. On paper, the rollout was a massive technical success. The IT department hit every deployment milestone, and usage rates were through the roof. On any given Tuesday, nearly 90% of the licensed users were interacting with Copilot Coworker. From a dashboard perspective, the investment looked like a home run. But when the leadership team sat down to find the actual business impact, the room went silent. There was no reduction in cycle times for loan processing. The volume of client reports hadn't increased. In fact, the quality of those reports had started to drift. Some were overly formal, while others were missing critical regulatory disclaimers. The manager in charge of the pilot was baffled. They had optimized for tool rollout. They had tracked logins, clicks, and time spent in app. They treated the transition like a software upgrade, as if giving someone a faster shovel automatically makes them a better landscaper. This is the classic supervision trap. The manager assumed that because people were using the tool, they were doing the work better. But without a structural redesign, the employees were simply using AI to do the wrong things faster. They were using it to summarize emails they should have just deleted, and they were drafting internal memos that nobody read. The vanity usage was high, but the economic value was zero. The manager was still measuring activity, while the system was leaking efficiency through 1,000 tiny gaps in logic and standard. An architect would have approached this pilot differently. Instead of focusing on the 300 licenses, they would have focused on the 300 workflows. When the architect intervened, the first move wasn't a training session on how to prompt. It was a deep clean of the grounding data. They realized the AI was pulling from 3 different versions of the company's credit policy because the SharePoint architecture was a mess. The AI wasn't failing, it was accurately reflecting a disorganized environment. The architect then moved to standardize the intent. They built a versioned pattern library, a central repository of gold standard prompts that were tested, vetted, and locked. If an analyst needed a risk summary, they didn't invent a prompt from scratch. They pulled the architected pattern from the library. This eliminated the variance that leads to hallucinations. It turned a creative guessing game into a repeatable engineering process. Finally, they established a feedback loop that treated errors as system bugs, not human mistakes. Every time the AI missed a data point, the architect didn't tell the user to try harder. They adjusted the metadata tags or refined the prompt logic in the shared library. The outcome was a shift from vanity usage to a reliable industrial-grade output system. They stopped hoping for productivity and started designing it. They realized that scaling a pilot isn't about adding more users. It's about hardening the system those users inhabit. This shift moved the firm from experimentation to execution. It proved that a managed tool is just an expense, but an architected workflow is an asset. Caselet 2, the Power Platform Sprawl Chaos. Let's look one level deeper into the infrastructure of modern work. I recently encountered a global logistics company that fell into a trap that is becoming all too common in the M365 ecosystem. And that trap is the sprawl of unmanaged autonomy. In an effort to be AI ready, they encouraged their managers to empower every department to build their own solutions. They wanted speed, they wanted agility. The leadership team gave their teams the green light to use the Power Platform and Copilot Studio to automate everything they could get their hands on, and within 6 months, they had created a monster. The organization was suddenly running on hundreds of unmanaged apps and automated flows. The result was duplicate logic everywhere. 3 different departments had built 3 separate tools to track the exact same shipping container data, but each used a slightly different calculation for estimated arrival. Because there was no central oversight, the data started to diverge. One manager was looking at a dashboard that said they were on schedule, while another was seeing a red alert. They hadn't created efficiency, they had created architectural debt on a massive scale. The failure here was a direct result of the old management mindset. The leadership team optimized for enablement speed, and they thought that by removing all barriers to creation, they were helping the company move faster. They ignored system coherence. They treated every new app as an isolated success story rather than a new node in an increasingly complex and fragile network. When a flow broke because a SharePoint column name changed, nobody knew who owned the fix. The system was a black box of shadow it that was now critical to daily operations but impossible to govern. This is where the architect move changes the trajectory. When the intervention began, the first step wasn't to shut down the apps, but to create a capability map. The architect stopped asking, "What can we build?" and started asking, "What should exist?" They mapped out the core business functions and identified where automation was actually required to move the needle. They realized that 90% of the custom-built tools were redundant. They weren't solving new problems. They were just reskinning old ones. The architect then implemented a rigorous environment strategy. They moved away from the Wild West approach and established clear boundaries for where and how data could be manipulated. They prioritized reuse over creation. In this new model, if a team wanted to build a new tracking tool, they first had to check the library of existing architected components. They were forced to build on top of a single governed source of truth. The outcome was a governed ecosystem where autonomy could finally scale. Because the boundaries were clear, the risk of duplicate logic vanished. The architectural debt was paid down, replaced by a lean, coherent system where every automated flow had a clear owner and a documented purpose. The company didn't lose its agility, it gained reliability. They moved from a state of managed chaos to a state of engineered performance. They stopped building more stuff and started building the right stuff. This is the hallmark of the architect. They understand that true speed doesn't come from running faster. It comes from making sure the path is actually clear. Caselet 3, the governance vacuum versus the gatekeeper. Let's talk about the third failure point, the governance tug-of-war. I recently worked with a healthcare tech firm that was paralyzed by 2 bad choices. On one side, they had the Wild West. This was their initial pilot where they let everyone connect their own data sources to Copilot without any checks. It felt fast, but it led to a massive data leak within 3 weeks. Sensitive patient billing data was suddenly accessible to the marketing team because the AI didn't care about folder structures. It only cared about permissions, and those permissions were a mess. On the other side, they had the gatekeeper response. The security team freaked out and locked everything down. They required a 7-page manual approval form for every new AI agent or custom connector. They treated AI like a dangerous chemical that had to be handled in a hazmat suit. The result? Adoption dropped to 0. The employees didn't stop using AI. They just moved their work to personal ChatGPT accounts on their phones. They went shadow AI because the official system was too slow to be useful. The manager in this scenario saw governance as a control gate. They thought their job was to stand at the door and say no until someone proved they were safe. But in a world of agentic systems, manual gates are just obstacles that people will climb over. If the governance is external to the workflow, it will always be seen as a burden. You're trying to use human discipline to solve a structural design problem. That never works. An architect looks at this vacuum and realizes that governance isn't a gate, it's a system design feature. When the architect stepped in, they used Agent 365 to build a centralized control plane. They didn't ask for permission forms. Instead, they engineered safe defaults directly into the environment. They created pre-approved data zones. If an agent stayed within Zone 1, using only public company data, it was auto-approved. If it needed Zone 3, sensitive billing data, the system automatically embedded the required encryption and audit logging into the agent's code before it could even run. They moved the policy from a PDF document into the actual data flow. They used Microsoft Purview to auto-label sensitive files, so Copilot Coworker would automatically redact PII before a user even saw the output. The governance became invisible. It wasn't a meeting you had to attend, it was the asphalt you drove on. By embedding policy into the workflow, they actually increased the speed of the organization. The outcome was a system where the rework rate plummeted. Because the data was clean and the boundaries were hard-coded, the AI stopped hallucinating based on restricted files. The need for manual reviews for every single output vanished because the system was secure by design. They realized that the best way to control a system isn't to slow it down, but to build a better track. Governance, when architected correctly, doesn't stop the car. It allows the driver to go faster without worrying about the cliff. This leads us to the biggest shift of all, how we actually measure if any of this is working. The orchestration, new rituals and metrics for architects. If you want to move from being a supervisor to becoming an architect, you have to change how you spend your time. Most managers are currently trapped in a loop of endless status meetings where they sit in a room and ask for task updates. In an agentic world, this is a massive waste of resources because the status is already visible in the system if your agents are doing the work. You don't need a meeting to hear what happened, but you do need a ritual to understand why the system behaved the way it did. The first major shift is replacing that status meeting with a weekly system review. This isn't about the people, it's about the loop. And as an architect, you aren't asking if a report is finished. Instead, you are asking diagnostic questions to find out where a human had to override an AI decision or what failure patterns are emerging in the agentic chain. If the AI consistently misses a specific regulatory requirement, that isn't a performance issue for the employee, it's a bug in the system architecture. You are looking for the friction points where the machine and the human are no longer aligned. This ritual forces you to treat your prompts and workflows like versioned assets that live and breathe. In the old model, a manager might give a verbal tip to a teammate, but in the architect model, that tip becomes a permanent update to the prompt and pattern library. You are building a collective intelligence that survives employee turnover, and you are ensuring the intent of the organization is refined every 7 days. This is how you pay down architectural debt before it bankrupts your productivity. To make this ritual effective, you have to stop tracking vanity metrics that don't move the needle. I see so many leaders bragging about hours saved or the total number of prompts sent, but these numbers are actually meaningless. If an employee saves 5 hours using AI but then spends 6 hours fixing the errors, you have actually lost ground. If they send 1,000 prompts but none of them result in a client-ready deliverable, you are just generating digital noise. These are metrics for supervisors who want to feel busy, and they are not for architects who want to be effective. Instead, you must commit to 4 hard metrics that actually prove the system is scaling. First is cycle time, which is the total time from the initial request to the final verified output. If this number isn't dropping by at least 20%, your architecture is too heavy and needs to be leaned out. Second is the rework rate, or the percentage of AI-generated outputs that require a human to step in and correct a mistake. In a well-designed system, this should trend towards 0, and if it stays stagnant, your grounding data is likely the culprit. Third is decision latency, which measures how long a task sits idle while waiting for a human approval or a clarification. High latency means your guardrails are too restrictive or your intent is too fuzzy for the machine to handle. Finally, you must track the incident rate, which includes everything from a hallucinated fact in a report to a compliance breach. Organizations that assign explicit architectural accountability to these systems see a 40% reduction in severe incidents over 2 years. They aren't luckier than you, they are just more disciplined about their design. Implementing this move requires a new layer of technology because you cannot architect a system you cannot see. This is why tools like WorkIQ are becoming the essential intent layer for the modern enterprise. WorkIQ allows you to see the relationships between people, data, and tasks in real time, and it provides the visibility you need to see where the collaborative friction is actually happening. It allows you to move from guessing to engineering. When you use WorkIQ as your foundation, you aren't just deploying a tool, you are building a scalable engine for autonomy. You are creating a world where the manager doesn't have to be the bottleneck for every decision, and you are building a system where the boundaries are so clear that the AI can act with high confidence. The human only intervenes when it truly matters, and this is the orchestration of the future. It's time to stop being the person who manages the work and start being the person who builds the machine that does the work. The AI transition isn't a technology shift, it is a leadership evolution. If your pilots are stalling, don't look at the software and instead look at your management model. You cannot supervise an agentic world, you must architect it. Stop managing people and start building the systems that make them effective. If this changed how you think about your role, follow me, Mirko Peters on LinkedIn for more structural clarity. Start building the track today.